Okay, we are live. First of all, happy Memorial Day, guys. I hope everyone has been enjoying their time. And remember those who gave their lives for this country. Let's see here. We'll just wait a couple seconds here for a few more folks to pop in. So I'm just getting this ready. This is very on the fly. Let's see. So if you guys haven't seen some of the previous live streams, we're up to the 7th one here now. So we've got some great previous ones. Last weekend we had Les Odell on. That was a great show talking about West Virginia cryptids. You can check that out and other live streams. We have a pretty awesome month coming up in June as well. Next week will be Karac St. Laurent, friend of mine from Crash Course Cryptozoology. He's always asking some really great questions in the chat. Previous episodes. If you haven't seen Lions of the East, my documentary about mountain lions and mystery big cats in New England, check that out on my website, Pedicom Media. There's a link down below to that. I'm going to be getting some DVDs in stock again pretty soon, but as for now, you can get the digital copies on there as well. And lastly, Chasing Legends, the project that I'm working with my buddy Nash Hoover and his crew on. We're launching a Kickstarter for that tomorrow, which is May 26th. So if you're rewatching this, chances are it's probably already live. The Kickstarter is to fund some of the expeditions and episodes that we're going to be planning on going on here across the U.S. when things sort of settle down. There's a link to that in description as well. So feel free to check that out if you would like to support that. And we're really excited for today's guest. It's Michelle Souliere. She is an illustrator and artist, from Portland, Maine. She has been an editor of the Strange Maine Gazette and its companion blog, which gave rise to her first book in 2010, Strange Maine, True Tales from the Pine Tree State. She owns the Green Hand Bookshop in downtown Portland, Maine, which opened in 2009, which at the time was a neighbor to the International Cryptozoology Museum. We've had Laurent on the show who runs the museum, so it's kind of cool that we're having a little bit of that continuation. Michelle has been interested in researching anomalous history and curious creatures in Maine and elsewhere. She is currently finishing up her work on her newest book, Bigfoot in Maine. We're really excited to talk to her about that, of course. So without further ado, let's bring in Michelle. Hey, Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Awesome. Happy to have you on the show. It's really I've been waiting for the book, and I think it's a really awesome topic that I don't think has gotten a lot of coverage. People think Bigfoot, they typically think of other parts of the country, whereas Maine, as I've said in other shows, including last week's, is one of the most forested states in America by percentage, really remote area. So very cool. I think we originally met at the cryptozoology conference there in Maine.
Yes.
So it's cool to have you on the show. Do you want to just go a little bit into your background? I sort of just gave a little bit of your bio there, but what kind of got you interested in anomalous phenomena and cryptids and that sort of stuff?
Well, like a lot of other people, when I was younger, I was forever casting around for weird books about UFOs and ghosts and everything else. I didn't really get stuck on cryptozoology until I think actually probably until around the time I met Loren Coleman and began reading some of his books. Because I don't think, like many people, I didn't realize how much current and past history there is for cryptozoology. And I found that really fascinating. My Strange Maine research has always been about what gets overlooked by the history texts. And local cryptozoology was absolutely fell in that category. Yeah. So of course I was like, one of the earlier posts I did on my blog was, hey, I had no idea this happened. Maybe you didn't either, but Maine has a history of, strange creatures.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's definitely the right person to get somebody interested in cryptozoology is Laurent. I know for a lot of us, even that have been following it since we were kids, Laurent was one of those people that we read about or we saw on TV a lot of the times. He's often quoted in a lot of the documentaries, and definitely cool that New England and Maine has that sort of institution there. And I can't think of a better way to get involved in that. Was there at first, when you first started looking at the cryptid stuff, just in a broad sense, was there any particular one that caught your interest that was over some of the other ones?
It was definitely the Bigfoot sightings that caught my eye, because the more I looked into it, the more possible it seemed. because of Maine's, unique properties as a state,
Right.
and the earlier records that I saw were so far back. I was like, it didn't jive with the popular explosion of Bigfoot lore that happened, much, much later in the 1900s. It was earlier than that. And I thought that was really interesting to me. So Bigfoot is definitely out of, I've been interested in, the wolves that disappeared and the accounts of the last wolves and all the cryptid cat
Yeah,
stories that are all over the place even today.
definitely.
So those were definitely, I was interested in those too, but the Bigfoot sightings or the Bigfoot related sightings seem to have deep roots. And that's what I generally tend to go after is, is stuff like that, where there's really something to dig through.
Definitely, that's a really interesting way to look at it, and I can appreciate that as someone a lover of history. I think it's always important to know the history when you're looking in a particular case like a cryptid. Just look at the background. On that
Mm-hmm.
note, do you want to talk a little bit about what gives Maine such unique properties? Obviously, we mentioned it's so forested. Maybe just a little bit of a history about Maine. I don't think a lot of people really know or even appreciate some of that history.
Yeah, it's the state is singularly well equipped to harbor large mammals. Which the preponderance of our black bear population is a good testament to that and a good
Right.
analog. Um, there's a massive amount of forest cover, which I don't think people realize how vast most of Maine is, because I think most people come into Maine, they'll come up the coast, maybe they'll go up the highway up, 95 and 295. And those are all pretty densely populated areas for Maine.
Right.
But as soon as you strike off of those main arteries, it's a whole other ball game. And I don't think people realize, or, the people who have encountered it realize, but the vast majority of people don't. And it's not only the forest cover, it's also that we have an insane amount of water sources
Right. Yeah.
because of the way the glaciers and everything swept across the state. There are ridges and gullies and scooped out ponds and lakes. So basically the whole state, if you just looked at all the water sources and routes throughout the state, it's like a net that runs all across the entire state.
Yeah, wow. Majority of the population, I'm assuming, probably lives in that southern portion anyway. So there would
Mm-hmm.
definitely be a lot of space. And I've said, just like I mentioned last week's show, Maine is the #1 forested state, and it you don't really get that the perspective until you actually go there. I mean, the first time I really went camping in Maine, as somebody in New Hampshire, we're next door. We have a lot of mountains. We also have a lot of woods, so we don't really go to Maine as much. But most of the times I ever went to Maine, it was to the Cryptozoology Museum or the Portland area. And
Yeah.
this past November, I went camping up near West Forks and in that area, and we drove
Yeah.
40 minutes from the nearest paved road, basically, and just found a campsite where there was moose tracks going through, and it was just the middle of absolute nowhere. And it's amazing. You're like, this is perfect territory for anything really to be out here. And as you mentioned, bear, moose, those are very common up there. Very healthy population of both of those animals.
Yeah, and that's you. I'm glad you mentioned the population density, because that's also key, because there's so much of the state it's unorganized territories. It's not municipal areas. There aren't a lot of people living there in large numbers together. Those tend to kind of congregate along the main thoroughfares of the highway system and the coast, and the rest of the state is wide open.
Absolutely. There was this map I came across this winter, or it was actually a website. It said nobody lives here or something like that. It was a map of population density in the US, and by far the most remote area of the entire eastern seaboard was northern Maine and parts of northern New Hampshire. It was just, there was nothing there in that entire northern part. And I understand a lot of Maine is owned by or not power companies, by lumber companies, and a lot of that is
Yeah.
private land. Do you know like a little bit more about that?
Um, Only bits and pieces. I know people who there a lot of places, a lot of the little camps you'll see tucked in up in the logging territories, off the Golden Road. Those are oftentimes camp lots that are rented from the lumber companies for 100-year leases. But basically it's dependent on the lumber company's needs. And if they decide they need the land back, they get the land back. So there's, even though it appears like there's privately owned land in a lot of those huge forested swaths, it's actually kind of borrowed. It's not actually
Okay.
owned. So
Interesting. Yeah, because I think that's a big difference between Maine and like some of the states out west, where there are also large swaths of territory that a lot of it is federal or state forest land, whereas most of Maine I don't think is really federal land or government land, so to speak, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's and if you've been up to the West Forks, then you might have been on some of the logging roads up there.
Absolutely. Yeah. We were driving around and there were big patches that were just logged out, and then you'd see just swaths of forest. And we drove around for a while and we kind of just picked a random spot. I have no idea if it was legal or not, but I mean, it was, we were 40 minutes from the closest paved road and we didn't see another living soul while we were there. And it was just, you just get that feeling of isolation. And if we were to break down there, I mean, I don't know what we would have done. No cell service. So luckily we had some survival kind of training in our background, myself and my friend who were there, and we kind of knew what we were doing, but it's not a walk in the woods. It's very serious out there, especially in November. There was already snow on the ground, which is pretty crazy, especially coming from more of the Boston area.
Yeah, it feels, there are certain places where it almost feels like you're on the moon. Like that's the only analogy I could think of when I was up on the logging roads. It is just so vastly different and so isolated, as you said, that you feel like you're on another planet almost.
Oh, it's amazing. We've got a comment here saying, I live next to Mount Katahdin, Maine. I know it's real, from Fiocchi. So there we go. That's Mount Katahdin is northern peak in the Appalachian Trail. I'm actually trying to hike it this summer. Finally, I haven't done that. Done all of New Hampshire's mountains. I'm really hoping when all this stuff settles down, I'm able to hike that this summer. It's a beautiful area in Baxter State Park. I'm assuming you've probably been up in that area, and just unreal.
Yeah.
So we've got a question here. Let's start taking a couple questions here. Question for Michelle: how far back in time go the records she researched, and where does she look for them? Public libraries, newspaper archives? Yeah, maybe just talk a little bit about kind of your process with your Bigfoot in Maine book.
Yeah, the historic stuff tends to be primarily digitized newspaper archives, because with their digitization, they're a lot easier to search, so you can start picking up keywords. And so that for a lot of the 1800 stuff, that's predominantly where that came from. Anything earlier than that tends to come from town histories, stray comments here and there about wild men in the area, based on affidavits from people who were living in the town at the time, or, say somebody who dug up a giant skeleton somewhere.
Wow.
Those are also catch my interest.
Definitely. Those are very popular nowadays. People talk about giant skeletons a lot.
Yeah. So yeah, there was one of those up in Deer Isle, which was very early on, and who knows where it is now. But yeah, those would be the primary sources for those various centuries. And then the 1900s, to the current day, again, using newspapers, but because a lot of them are pay for view, it's actually tougher to search the modern newspapers now.
Yeah.
A lot of that access is locked down. But I did that type of research work for, the first 10 or 15 years that I was working on the book. And
wow.
I felt like there was some interesting stuff there, but I felt like I was only scratching the surface. And about 5 years ago, I started putting the word out that I was looking to talk to eyewitnesses. And that's when things really changed. So all of the bulk of my current, say the last 50 years worth of sightings that I've talked to people about is all eyewitness based, anecdotes and testimony. So, which has turned out to be far more interesting than I ever imagined.
There's nothing like talking to some of the eyewitnesses. That's probably one of my favorite elements of it. You mentioned 10 to 15 years. So have you been working on it for longer than that? You said the initial 10 to 15 years. So it seems like it's been a long process, huh?
Yeah, well, the blog and the Gazette started back around 2005. Um, and then Laurent talked to me about co-writing the book with him originally.
Awesome.
And so the serious pursuit of it started around that time, which would have been 2009, 2010. And here we are in 2020. So it's been a long process. There were a lot of setbacks along the way, but I feel like in the end, even though I was frustrated and undercut by a lot of the setbacks, in the end, I think I wound up with a much better book because I completely changed the direction I was taking because of talking to the eyewitnesses. So it's actually worked out much better, and I think people are going to be really excited to check it out.
I know I definitely am. And I want to talk to you afterwards, even just about some of the process, because I've been thinking about doing a book about Bigfoot sightings in New Hampshire. I've talked to a lot of people in this area and have some of these really unique sightings that have happened in New Hampshire that I've looked into. And I just think it would be interesting. But we've got a comment from Map11 says, love your Port Henry sweatshirt. Hello, Michelle. I grew up in Vermont. Oh, yeah, this is the Port Henry Home of Champ shirt there. So we're representing Champ here. Fiocchi says, love the Golden Road. Is that an area? I'm not familiar with that. What is the Golden Road?
That's the main artery of the logging roads.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so like when you've gone to the check-in station and you've talked to the lumber company personnel that man the gate and everything, and you sign in their little book and you pay them the fee.
Wow.
And you're on the Golden Road.
I got to check that out. I have so many plans for Maine since I've just sort of been discovering it in recent years. Plum Creek owns the Northern Forest. That's what Billy Fowley says. So looks like that's a large kind of national logging company.
Yeah.
Interesting. Here's a good one from Crash Course Cryptozoology. This is Karac. He's going to be on the show actually next week. He says, really cool seeing Michelle on. I went to the museum when it was still in the bookstore as a kid. Has she noticed any commonalities or patterns in the locations or seasons of Maine sightings? That's a really good question.
Yeah, I would say definitely it's everybody I've talked to that has had like kind of a long-term interest in keeping an eye on these things has found that winter, like they're still around in the winter, but it's a much slower, there's much less activity in the winter.
Interesting.
So that's definitely a seasonal difference. Yeah, I'd really spring, summer, and fall seem to be pretty active, partly because that's when all the food sources are out.
Right. There's a lot of things in hibernation as well. I mean, for the some of the other animals, but you do still have moose and deer around. I know and we have a very similar climate here in New England, but I've heard that from people too. Other places that the winter there seems to be less activity, then it kind of picks up a bit. So that's definitely interesting. My buddy Stefan says, hey, Michelle, what are your thoughts on Cassie, one of the famous cryptids in Maine, described as a sea serpent? That's the Casco Bay monster, for those that aren't aware. Thanks, Stefan.
Yeah, there's a whole slew of sightings running up the New England coast into Maine that are really interesting, and some of them are really detailed. So it's something that I've wanted to dig into, but since I'm working on the Bigfoot stuff right now, I'm kind of I'm sort of holding that as something to look into further in the future. But it's what I've seen so far has been really fascinating. A lot of really detailed accounts in old newspapers, which they took the time sometimes to illustrate. So
yeah,
there's a lot of material to dig into.
Yeah, I've looked into some of that stuff a little bit for a presentation. I did a couple events about cryptids of New England, and I included Cassie, and also talked about the Gloucester sea serpent and that sort of famous wave of sightings down on the Massachusetts coast, and how some of it kind of happened at the same time as some of the Casco Bay stuff. Definitely interesting. I mean, Maine obviously has a lot of coastline, and there's more than just lobster in those waters, right?
Right.
As famous as the Maine lobsters are. David C. Gulliver says, I'm always amazed when I hear that we are surrounded by Bigfoot. As a Maine native and currently living in coastal NH, Rockingham County, my wife and I walk the rails to trails looking for sign. Okay, interesting. Yeah, definitely. We're surrounded by woods here. And I think that's one of those things I've talked about in previous shows. People just don't know how much forest there actually is in the Northeast up here, at least in the upper 3 states in New England, from Vermont to Maine. Maine obviously topping out everybody.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time during my research looking at the Google Maps satellite imaging so you can see the tree cover. And it's really eye-opening because you can see the green corridors and where they lead and how many of them there are and how interconnected they are. It's surprising, even with the amount of development we've had, it hasn't obstructed many of the greenways. A lot of them still remain intact all the way down to the coast, which I was really surprised by.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Matt Barnes says, if ever there'd be a good place for Sasquatch to hide, it'd be certainly in the Maine woods. Have a couple buddies that deer hunt there, and they have to take a GPS in the woods with them. Yeah, I wouldn't go out there without a GPS, especially some of the more northern areas. Just so much going on there. Absolutely. So do you want to maybe say a little bit about some of the areas that perhaps on the Golden Road, I think it was, that you've checked out? Have you ever had anything interesting happen or anything of note or any other animal encounters or anything like that?
I've been up to the Golden Road a couple of times with a couple different people, going to different areas of it, and definitely in amidst all the barren, like the crazy shale roads that you drive on, and all the trees, and then the logging swaths that are cut through them, you definitely run across so many traces and sightings of moose.
Yeah.
Definitely saw at least one black bear who saw us coming and just like galumped away. So that worked out well for everybody. Yeah, so there's plenty of animal diversity to be found up there. And there's a lot of little pockets where it's not necessarily being logged, where the little camps and everything are, usually around the ponds and lakes in the area. It can be a little tougher to get up to the rivers because the landscape is so much more dramatic, but a lot of people spend a lot of time rafting up and down them in season. The camps are around, like one of the camps I went to was up on there's a little series of the little roach ponds up by Cocajo, which is like one of those little waypoints where you can restock at the camp store and get things you need before you head off into the vast wilderness. And rabbits, so many rabbits everywhere. Yeah, it simultaneously provides the impression of a very vast and arid area because of the roads and the rock cover of the land, and just total lush, verdant greenery and animal life juxtaposed.
Yeah, the Appalachian Trail goes through a big portion of Maine, and from what I've heard from people that have done it, it's actually one of the toughest parts. That's called the 100-mile wilderness, I guess, because along most of the trail you can stop and refill every 2-3 days in a town and get your food supplies, whereas when you're in that area, it's like 7-8 days of just there's nothing, so you have to bring a lot more food. I've heard it's pretty challenging. I haven't hiked Maine much, but since I've done the New Hampshire 48 4,000 footers, there's the New England 67, which includes Katahdin and a bunch of the other peaks. So I'm definitely hoping, as I mentioned earlier about Katahdin, to check out some of those areas and hike some of the peaks in Maine, because they just look so much more remote even than the White Mountains we have here, just because there's not really much proximity of people in the area. But question I had was about the witnesses. So you've probably talked to a lot of eyewitnesses. Are there any that really kind of stand out in your mind, without going too much into details, but about like the character of the people? I mean, I'm assuming a lot of the folks you're talking to are people that have kind of grown up in the area. They know the woods, they know the wildlife, they've been camping their whole lives, or they work in one of these industries that's in the woods a lot. Do you want to just share a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, there's an interesting mix of people in the eyewitness pool, so to speak. There are the people who have lived here all their lives and spend a lot of time sort of in and out of camps in the woods and stuff like that, but had this one-off encounter that totally blew their minds, and they weren't expecting, and they hope to never see anything like that again.
Wow.
And then there are the people who wound up encountering activity on a regular basis near where they lived or worked. And in a lot of cases there wound up may have talked to people who, also live and work around them, who for decades had been having encounters like that in the area. So it's there's an interesting dichotomy. Some people who, it may take them a decade or two to finally get around to being like, I want to know more about this, from the initial shock of having your paradigm totally changed by one split-second encounter. But yeah, a lot of I noticed that hunters in particular, not all of them, but there were a few who have a really hard time with not being the alpha predator anymore.
I can imagine, yeah.
After their encounter. And then there are guys who are out fishing, who it's a very quiet pursuit. You're just out there doing your thing. And
see a lot of wildlife, yeah.
Yeah, and I think in those situations, there's a lot of chance for surprises on both sides.
Wow.
Because neither of you are making noise, and then suddenly you're both in the same place. And all right. So
yeah, wow.
A lot of different dynamics that go on with sightings.
Definitely. Do you think there's still a little bit of a cultural or regional stigma, perhaps, that people just don't want to share? I mean, places like Northern California, Bigfoot's very popular. Washington State. I've noticed in parts of New England, it's kind of still taboo to talk about, or you don't want to be seen as crazy. Is that the case in Maine?
Yeah, a lot of the people I'm talking to are people who had encounters decades ago, who are now maybe getting a little closer to retirement age. They're older. They're not as worried about what people think about them anymore. But back when it happened, they didn't talk to anybody about it because of that stigma. Or it could be somebody who was in a family where another family member reported, to the authorities, to the local game wardens, let's say, what had happened, and the way that snowballed, and the way they were treated by people in authority and by the press, created an example that the rest of the community saw and said, okay, we are not talking to anybody about anything we see. Maybe we'll go to you guys and talk to you because you've seen it and you know it's real and you're not going to make fun of us. But there's no way, seeing what happened to you, that we're going to go and talk to anybody to have this put on record, because why would you bother? If you're just going to get ridiculed, it's not worth it.
Yeah, that's something I think that comes up a lot in the subject and all over the place, really. But I think New England in particular has that, because it's just not culturally acceptable. I mean, maybe it's changed a little bit now, with everyone kind of knows Bigfoot as this lovable sort of forest thing. They see it in the commercials for beef jerky or kids animated movies, so it's a little bit more approachable. But there's still, I mean, if you're this big hunter type, you don't want to. Maybe it's something you'd be a little bit more reluctant to talk about.
Yeah, and I think weirdly enough, because of how in a lot of circles it's kind of something to joke about, but the show Finding Bigfoot, I think, did a huge amount for giving people permission to talk straightforwardly about it, because it brought it to a level of national recognition that this is a widespread phenomena. It's not just the Pacific Northwest. It's not just the skunk ape in Florida. There is a whole country in between where, state borders are just lines on a map. Right. Anything in the wild just walks through those borders and doesn't even know they're there. So, of course, it's a sprawling phenomena. And I think the best thing that Finding Bigfoot did for the scene was to let people see other people like themselves talking about it and not being made fun of, being asked questions about what they saw, when they saw it, where they saw it, what they thought about it, and how it affected them. And I think that changed the conversation drastically for the better. So even though, finding Bigfoot, everybody loves to make fun of finding Bigfoot, but it was a game changer. So
I couldn't agree more. I remember just the amount of people that weren't into this stuff. I mean, I was into this since I was a kid, but people who maybe had never thought about Bigfoot were talking about the show. And, knowing some of the people that were on the show, they do some great work. And Cliff is actually going to be on the program in June. So I'm excited to talk to him about that. And like you said, they did a really great job of just showing that it's not just Washington State. There's other places where this happens, at very legitimate encounters, and that definitely put it on the map. So we have a lot of really good questions coming in. So I'm going to start going into that. We have one here that's going to switch us from Bigfoot for a moment. But Stefan asks, thoughts on the specter moose, which is described as a giant white moose. Could it be a larger than average albino moose? Thanks. And that's a great one. That's one I've read about too. And sort of Maine cryptid is a giant moose or the white moose.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I did a whole presentation on it. God, it's been a while now, but down at the Booth Bay Library. And there's a surprising amount of newspaper articles about it. And then a really good book that, what's his first name? Michaud did about the specter moose because of his family's history with it, maybe a year or so ago. So there's a lot of good material out there. You just have to know where to track it down.
Right.
And as with every story like this, there are also, one of the other things I encountered were newspaper articles where people tried to take credit for the specter moose, which I thought was an interesting. So like as with Bigfoot, where you have people saying, "Oh, I was running, so cousin so-and-so was running around in a costume or whatever." And that's what the monster was. For the specter moose, there was at one point a reporter that purportedly interviewed a small crew of guys who told him that it was a draft horse from one of the lumber camps that had been let run free after they'd finished for the season. So, but I don't see most Mainers conflating a draft horse and a moose. I think most of them would know.
Right.
So I think those were probably guys just trying to take the spotlight to themselves for a little while as tall tale tellers. So
yeah, obviously a lot of tall tales like that. But I do think it's interesting that there are albino moose. I mean, that's a phenomenon that's happened. There's also probably been some really extremely large bull moose out there that have defied explanation. I mean, I've never seen one truly to the proportion of some of the reports, but I know there's also what we have here in New Hampshire. It's really affecting the moose population, especially in the northern part of the state. The ticks, they're absolutely decimating them, and what happens is they get thousands of them and they start rubbing themselves on the tree to the point where they basically lose all their fur and they're kind of just bleeding, and it can look almost whitish from a distance. It looks kind of mangy. So maybe in the past people may have seen that and didn't really have an explanation for it. I don't know, but the specter moose is definitely a really cool story, and thank you for that, Stefan. So we've got another cool one from Karac here, who asks, a lot of people put stock into the theory that Sasquatch, if they exist, migrate. Is there any data among the Maine reports to suggest this?
More often what I've heard is that, like black bears, they move through a large territory, kind of in a loop, depending on when food sources are coming available, because it's all seasonally based. And also, obviously, if you want to maintain a food source, you don't just like clear it flat. You use a little bit of it and then you move on to something else and let it repopulate.
Of course.
So what I'm hearing mostly is that there are, anywhere from like 20 to 40 mile territories that are being moved through, maybe not by the entire family group, sometimes by just maybe like the food gathering party from the family group, but that seems to be, from people I've talked to who are doing regular field observations, they're finding traces that indicate a regular movement through areas with returns like, every few weeks or every month, along the same region.
Yeah, that seems to check out in my book. I mean, I know in the past that people put a lot more stock into the migration theory, but I think overall it's been evolving more perhaps to that there is more of a resident, I mean, population. A lot of animals have a range where they sort of traverse mountain lines, especially. They have a large range that they kind of utilize, and like you said, they'll move into different areas and let things kind of come back. Bill says we have what we call ghost moose. They get infested with ticks and turn white. Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. Thanks, Bill. So continuing back with the questions, we got a lot of ones. I'm going to combine these two questions because I think they're pretty similar, from Daniel and another guy. It says, besides Bigfoots, what kind of cryptids are most commonly sighted in Maine? Any dogman sightings? As well as the question that says, what cryptids are reported in Maine? I think they kind of go well together.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely have had dogman sighting reports. I think there was an episode of Paranormal Witness that followed a specific one in, was it Palmyra, Maine? I'm hoping there's two different P towns that I get mixed up. So maybe, but Linda Godfrey covered it in her one of her books.
Oh, cool.
So she wrote about it as well. And then since then, there have been other very strange dogman type sightings. I actually heard one last night that was about a very peculiar story, which the person who saw the creature said it looked almost like a kangaroo.
Wow.
That like shuffled as it walked, but that's the strangest one I've heard so far. But yeah, there are definitely some dogman sightings. Other cryptids, I mean, obviously we have, the Cassie, the sea serpents and stuff like that. There are people who have reported things akin to thunderbirds, like very large flying creatures. There are of course, the mystery cats, the melanistic, the black cougars that people have reported seeing, including people who are employed as game wardens and stuff like that.
Right.
Reporting seeing very clearly what is a big cat, but is not the typical tawny color. It's a pure black version. Let's see, what else is there? I don't know. Maine's got a lot of cool wildlife to begin with, so I feel like we haven't had to invent many cryptids.
Right.
And the ones that are here, people tend to kind of keep to themselves because, again, who's going to believe them? Like oversized wolves. That's another one that could be considered a cryptid here in Maine. Yeah, and then I've had people inquire as to whether I knew anything about giant eels.
Okay.
And there's also, besides the sea serpent type sightings, there's also up in on the Quebec border. There's a lake up there that has that we share the border with Quebec.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I forget the name of it, but
a legendary a lake monster there. So
yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, that's the one thing when I was doing Lions of the East, Maine was one of the areas I didn't really touch that much on, just a little bit, but Maine was one of the areas where mountain lions survived the longest, if you want to kind of talk about the sort of the last mountain lion that was killed in each state. Maine's lasted till like 1938, I think the last one was killed. I mean, you can see why. It's just such a wild area for it. But that's cool. Maine definitely is not underrated in terms of cryptids. That's for sure, at least in my book. So Estelle Harrington says, we've had them in the late 1970s and 80s in Newry, Maine. It's more populated now where I live, so nothing lately. I think that was in reference to the Maine Bigfoot sightings. Raptor Crazy says, I have a question. Have you two ever heard of reports of people living in the country that have had stuff missing out of their gardens the next day? Maine has a good amount of agriculture, so anything along those lines?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, one of the eyewitnesses I talked to, she was a young girl when this happened, and something had been in their garden and left huge footprints very clearly in the dirt. Presumably because it was taking stuff out of the garden. So that's definitely a common thing. And actually, the really early wildman sightings in the Scarborough-Gorham area, which were very, very early on, those, although I don't think those were actually Bigfoot, I think those were just, feral humans, doing their thing away from civilization, because they would occasionally talk to the people. So that's kind of a giveaway. But they were milking cows, stealing peas and beans out of the gardens, stealing corn. So those were like, if you want to tie the early wildman sightings to the Bigfoot stories, there's definitely a long historic precedent for that continues into the current day.
Yeah, wow. We have a cool question from Sasquatch. We have a lot of activity in north central Indiana. The activity starts in early May and it always stops a few days before the first freeze. Have you seen this type of pattern elsewhere?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that would tie in with the pattern of the sightings quieting down in the colder months. I suspect that you probably only notice activity if you're going out into really remote areas or really paying attention once the snow cover hits. Because the landscape changes so quickly in between snowfalls. And probably I don't know, Indiana's probably not known for its high elevation. So I was going to say, I could see a family group moving to a lower elevation for certain types of the season. But yeah, I don't know if anybody's mentioned anything that specific, but in general terms, yes.
Wow. Yeah, that is something interesting. Obviously, Maine's seasons are very varied. Do you want to maybe just say, for people who don't really know much about Maine, what's the weather like in Maine? Over the course of the year.
I'm in Portland, so we have it relatively easy. And even here, it's cold. My husband's from Aroostook County, so that's a whole other ball of wax up there. They don't lose their snowpack until after April.
Wow.
And a lot of times, at least back when he was growing up and in high school and had his own first car, a lot of the cars up there actually have plugs wired in where you can plug in the engine block at night so that it doesn't freeze overnight because it gets so cold. But yeah, so I would say most of the state is pretty cold. Like, we're just starting to be able to open the windows like in the last week or two here. So like mid-May, if we're feeling really ballsy, we can open the windows. We freeze a little bit, but we're happy for the fresh air, so we're running with it.
Right.
And I mean, we've had snow. Aroostook gets snow in October usually. They start getting snow off and on. And in Portland, we'll start getting our first freezes in October, and then usually first snow sometime in November. So a lot of people will joke that we only get, 3 months of good weather. So it's why there was a lot of snowbirds in Maine.
Right. Yeah.
When you get older and your bones ache, you're just like, you know what? I know this is still going to be here when I come back, so let's go south for a month or two.
Absolutely. Yeah. Parts of it almost seem like more like Canada, people that might be from Canada.
Yeah.
Quebec, obviously, it's I know, even just being in kind of the southern New Hampshire area, going up to Quebec in November, it's like so much drastically colder than it is.
Yeah.
And that was when I was in November back there in West Forks. We were coming from an area where there wasn't any snow yet, drive 6 hours north to where we were getting, and there was already a couple inches of snow on the ground up there in West Forks, and this was like early November.
Yeah. Yeah, and the cold up there feels so different. If you're used to like the southern Maine, southern New Hampshire winter cold, it's like, yes, it gets cold, but then you go up there and you're like, oh, this is different.
Very different type of cold. Absolutely. Now, this is a really cool question from Kevin Hamilton. Indigenous people in Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. have a long history of carving Bigfoot imagery into their totems. Is there anything similar done among native bands in the East? Yeah, that's a cool question.
Yeah, if there is, they haven't been forthcoming about it, and it's not generally on record here. I know there are some tribes in the in the western part of the US that definitely have well-known iconography that's very, very important to their tribes. That's kind of gotten out into the popular media. And
Definitely.
yeah, and Maine has the tribal heritage here I can't speak to because I haven't really been able to talk to anybody in the tribal groups. I've tried a few different times, but so I don't know for sure. But I know it's not publicly known that they do. So,
Right. Yeah.
and that's all I can speak to because it's not, the rest of it's not mine to speak to.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I've heard of just some stories here from New Hampshire from people that are associated with the Abenaki, at least some of the Abenaki bands that were here in New Hampshire and in parts of Vermont, but really not a lot. I know the Iroquois supposedly had some sort of stuff, but like you said, I can't really speak to it either. That's not really an area I look into that often. And those people obviously have their own stories and folklore. And I think a lot of the times what happens is people sort of attribute stories that may be of something else to Bigfoot just because it kind of fits a modern day, oh, this just sounds like Bigfoot, it must be Bigfoot kind of thing. And I think there may be some parts of that happen, and that's unfortunate, but people will often try to get things to fit their agenda in some cases. Anyway, here's a cool question from Les, who was on the show last week, asking Michelle, what is the oldest possible Bigfoot account you have found in your research? That's a cool one.
Yeah. There's something really far back in some of Champlain's writing that was pretty interesting, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. So that would have been
1600s, I believe.
1600s? Yeah, that's what I would say. And then I know that the stuff in the Gorham Scarborough area, like the wild man stuff, was in the, I think I figured out approximately in the late 1700s. There was a giant skeleton uncovered up in Deer Isle, which could have just been a large human, but the fact that there were giant people here is an interesting piece of the puzzle too. And that was dug up in the 1800s, I believe, which means the skeleton itself would have been much older than that because the tree roots had grown around the skeleton. So it had been there for a very long time. I'm trying to think what else. The earliest reportings of ape-like creatures, which, something giant that somebody reported that looked like a giant ape, but that was walking on two legs, would have been mid to late 1800s. There were a couple of those. And then around, I think, mid 1800s, there was the little, the smaller little black monkey-like creature that was found, which was probably actually a monkey, but
interesting.
But that was mid 1800s.
Some people have talked about the Pamula being sort of a almost Wendigo-like or sort of moose-like creature. Some people have even, I've read on some sites they say that that's like a Bigfoot legend. I don't know how accurate that is, if that's just another one of those cases of it being attributed to Bigfoot. Do you know anything about the kind of Pamula stories?
Yeah, I've tried to look into that. The problem is so much of it is just transmitted through white folklorists from the early part of the 1900s or the late 1800s that it's really difficult to say because clearly based on that and then other people who have tried to do a better explanation of it later on, nobody really got what was being talked about in the sense of Pamula. And the only thing I can think is that it's definitely like a guardian spirit type.
Right. Associated with Katahdin, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so I could totally see people conflating that with, because a lot of people also think of Bigfoot in terms of being a guardian spirit of the forest. So I could see that would be a really easy parallel to draw. And as any descriptions of Pamula I've read, which are many and varied and strange, they always mention it being on two legs.
Interesting.
So it was bipedal. So that would also match.
Right. Yeah. I could see why. I could see somebody maybe snatching that story and saying it definitely is Bigfoot then in like a modern context. People do that all the
Yeah.
time, unfortunately. This is
Yeah.
actually.
I was going to say quickly, there are some Katahdin-based sightings. So obviously when you're up there, keep your eye out. But I have not had any luck tracking down sources for any of them. So it's very difficult to find more details on them. But so keep your eyes and ears open when you're up there.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never been up that far in Maine. So the furthest north like I said, was West Fork. So I'd be real excited to get up there and just see what else is going on in terms of other wildlife. But this comment, I think, kind of relates to what you were saying earlier. It says, inside the October 1886 pages of the Industrial Journal of Bangor lies the story of the 10-foot tall wild man, 7-foot arms, and hair all over his body.
Yep. Yeah, that was one of a couple of stories that came out of the late 1800s where reports came supposedly out of the North Maine woods of a creature, a maniac, covered in hair, who was basically massacring loggers. So the piece in the Bangor Industrial magazine is just a little tiny snippet. There are slightly longer versions of it that show up in other newspapers because, like today, there's the whole weird news contingent in the Associated Press or the Wire service or whatever they were using back then, where if one state had a really singular story, newspapers all across the country would run with it. So that story kept getting repeated over and over and over again across the country for, God, probably another decade almost. So there were a couple of stories. I'm trying to remember if there's two of them. There's that one that he mentioned, the 1886 one, and then there's also one about a decade later. And one of the two of them mentioned that they were in a logging camp that was about, I think they said like 100 miles north of Moosehead Lake, which would actually put them right up at the Canadian border. So one of the problems with finding backup articles could be that if it was in Quebec or was in Canada, there's not a lot of crossover in the newspapers between the two countries, and it might make it harder because of language barriers and stuff like that to track articles about the original case.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something I remember reading just about one of those stories where it did involve, sort of a humorous Frenchman. That's what they described it as, I think, in the articles. They said something, and that there is kind of that little bit of that stereotype about the French Canadians, and that always does interest me. The fact that you don't hear about a lot of reports from Quebec that there's maybe a lost in translation sort of thing. I don't know, but I did want to ask you real quick. Last question I'm going to ask, I promise, guys, because I know there's a lot of questions still in here. What do you think about kind of yellow journalism at the time? Do you think that has any effect on a lot of the wild man sort of reports? Because I've always pondered that myself.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole slew of wild man reports in Maine around the same time as the Winstead, Connecticut wild man story came out. So there's definitely something that happens where awareness of a singular occurrence happens, and then there's almost copycat kind of things happening where things that normally would not have been called like a wild man sighting became wild man sightings because of the popularity of that phrase and the amount of newspapers it sold.
Yeah, I noticed that with yeah, definitely. I noticed that with Lake Champlain, some of the reports that happened around the same time as the Gloucester sea serpent, people were saying almost in the Lake Champlain area, joking around and saying, "Oh, well, while Massachusetts has its own monster, we have something here in the lake," almost like a kind of competition sort of thing. And I've heard from that time period as well, if you didn't have a lake monster or a sea serpent, as they would call it, in your lake, it was bad for tourism if you didn't have those stories. So maybe that's part of it too. I think it's really interesting because a lot of this is just predicated on humans and our fallibilities in a lot of ways, which I think is a whole different kind of debate. But Okay, so we have a bunch of more questions. I don't want to keep you here too much longer, but we have some pretty interesting questions. So if you're okay with that, I'll just kind of go through some of the questions. And
Go
so
ahead.
Jordan asks, "Hey guys, good show as always. Question: What is Michelle's view on Bigfoot and UFOs seen together? Has she gathered or heard of any reports of both in Maine?" Good question, Jordan. Thank you.
That is a good question. I haven't talked to a lot of people who equate the two with each other. I have talked to a fair amount of eyewitnesses who have seen both at different times. But I haven't talked to anybody with a concurrent sighting. I'm pretty sure Nomar Slavik's in his UFOs in Maine book, or maybe it was in the next one. Anyways, one of his main Bigfoot cases is a Loring Air Force Base case, which I believe did involve UFOs and a Bigfoot sighting in the same series of events. So
I think I'm aware of that one.
Yeah,
I know that the famous Allagash sightings; those were pretty interesting.
Yeah, those are wild.
And that is a pretty wild area too, the Allagash area.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah, and they try to keep it that way too.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because people, when we're talking about a state like Pennsylvania, when I was talking to my guest Sean Forker the other week, that's a state where there seems to be a lot of Bigfoot and UFO stuff together. I mean, that's where I had my UFO experience on a property where people are having incredible Bigfoot activity for decades. So I don't know what that means, why it's kind of in one area or the other, but in my experience too, in New England, most of the sightings I've seen typically are just, or that I've heard or read about or been talking to folks about their experiences, were mostly just behaving the way an animal would, in the sense that is interacting with its environment, usually fleeing away from the person, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So,
or trying to chase the person away.
Definitely, yeah. The territorial stuff. I can imagine some of those more remote areas, perhaps you're not as used to people. Animals are a little more aggressive, or just trying to kind of keep control of their territory.
Yeah.
So speaking of Quebec,
something like that.
LEM says, "Hello, does Michelle investigate sightings reports from Quebec and New Brunswick as well?"
I have not in the past, but I would be very interested to hear about them. One of the things that was kind of a big good, wake up call was reminding myself, like, when you look at a map of the US and Maine is up here on the end, and then, Canada is up there, most of the time you don't realize, because of the way the maps are drawn, how much we share of a state border with Canada. Like, it reaches way down on the eastern side in a way that I think most people forget about because of the way maps are usually edited and cut. So like I was saying before about the border lines, like, animals that are moving across state and national borders aren't paying attention to those lines like we do.
Definitely.
So of course there's got to be a lot of interplay between New Brunswick and Quebec and Maine. So I mean, I would definitely be interested in hearing about those too. One of the guys I talked to is right up by the border in Baileyville. So I know there's definitely, and I know there's a lot of New Brunswick sightings too. So yeah, they're all neighbors.
Yeah, there was this one lady I had kind of spoken to a little bit when I was doing Lions of the East. She had gotten on the New Brunswick side, I believe, a video of a mountain lion walking in a field that they said was most definitely probably a mountain lion. And it was a town that was bordering Maine. So you can easily imagine that animal might just go into Maine and then be responsible for some sightings in Maine. Because like you said, the animals it's just a border on a map, and it's mostly just woods. It's not really, there's not a fence in a lot of places, or any kind of a barrier.
Yeah, or there might be a river, which, most animals can cross at most times of the year. So, yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. These are just two funny comments I saw, I think, in regards to what we're talking about with the weather. Snowed May 11th, boating 80 degrees May 22nd. Yeah, that seems about right.
Weird year for a number of reasons.
And Bill says, "I'm in central Maine. Last week I mowed the lawn with an inch of snow on it."
Yeah.
Seems about right.
Luckily that didn't stick.
Yeah, right. No, that was wild. I saw a picture posted online somewhere where somebody in New Hampshire had opened up their pool, and they were, as a joke, they kind of it had snowed, and they were sitting on their inner tube or like a little floaty in the pool as there's just snow everywhere. It was like this is just New England right here.
It's very surreal.
Amazing. But here's besides cryptids, do you research any strange disappearances in Maine's forests that could be related to their predatory behavior?
I know that there are a few Maine cases in the Missing 411 books. I've definitely read through those cases, which I found interesting. But I haven't run across anything other than what he's saying in that book that might correlate. But it's like, speaking as somebody who's, interested in all strange Maine things, including crime, and looking at missing persons reports, it's very difficult to find a comprehensive listing of them. There's certain lists that are, known missing persons, but you have to know that there are also lots of other missing persons that aren't on those lists because it was assumed something else happened to them, something natural or, act of God, or who knows what. So it's a difficult thing to research, which I'm sure Pallades could tell all of us.
There's been a lot of disappearances. I know the famous one a couple of years ago, the lady who went missing on the Appalachian Trail, or maybe not a couple of years ago, but that was on the show Northwood's Law, I believe. They covered that, and I know they did that show until they switched it. They were in Maine the first 5 seasons, and they switched over to New Hampshire recently, which has been interesting because I used to watch it when it was on the Maine one, and now I see it and it's in New Hampshire. I'm like, oh, I've been to a lot of those places. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool to see familiar landscapes in those shots.
Definitely. Map 11 says visit Vermont, New Hampshire, or Maine, John. New England is gorgeous in the summer and, of course, the fall. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to beat our foliage here.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we'll take just one more question. This is from Sasquatch. He says, another question, you mentioned garden visits in old accounts. Have you seen any specific target foods in modern reports? Pears and cantaloupe?
Well, you wouldn't have pears and cantaloupe in Maine. You have things like corn, beans, peas. Those are, I've definitely talked to an eyewitness who used to talk to the farmers in his area as well when he was a kid after he had his sightings. And he talked to a guy who, I'm pretty sure he was a corn farmer, and the guy was like, oh yeah, I'll be out there on my tractor, and he's sitting there looking at me. And so I stopped and smoked my cigarette and looked at him, and then he left and I went back to work, so there's, so the cornfields are definitely of interest, but there's also a lot of wild produce. So instead of pears and cantaloupes, we're going to have stuff like, blackberries, blueberries, raspberries growing wild. And then probably there's probably a lot of apple orchard use, but you would never know because there are so many apples in general when you're running an orchard that, if somebody's plucking a few here and there, it's not going to register. So we probably would never know unless it was somebody's favorite apple that they'd been growing and were really excited that it was just about to be perfect and then it disappeared. Then you might hear about it. But
Absolutely. So just one more question, though, because I do like this one, if you don't mind. Guy 15 says, can you tell us any creepy stories that you've heard? Maybe if you want to share, if there's one story that might be kind of creepy or anything without giving too much away, if that's, hopefully it's not too tough of a question. There's so many stories that end up being creepy or the person is kind of traumatized that I've heard, and it's always interesting.
That's a good question. I would have to say that the stuff that I've talked to people about up in Aroostook, where they've been, basically in the middle of nowhere on like their favorite fishing pond up there. There aren't people around. And if anybody was coming in with their vehicle, you would hear them. And having something tracking around the pond you're sitting on a float in the middle of, and, breaking things and making really obvious noises. and then eventually kind of circling around you towards where your truck is parked, and then uttering a horrifying roaring screech
Oof.
that echoed everywhere and went right through your breastbone while you're sitting there in your float trying to fish. Those are probably the most terrifying stories.
Wow.
That was, yeah, he never went back there again. So even though he'd been there like dozens of times, and it was his lifetime favorite spot to fish, he was always going to fish there for the rest of his life. And nope, not anymore.
That's
yeah. So that's because when you're out there, when you're out there by yourself, like you were saying, when you're out on those roads, miles and miles and miles from anybody, it puts things in a different perspective.
It's a vulnerable feeling in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You have something like that.
Sitting in the middle of a pond in your waders and your float, and you have to get back to your truck, and that's where you heard the noise last. That would change my approach to fishing a lot too. So
yeah, I can only imagine. Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, and loved having you on the show. For people that are interested in finding out more about some of your research and any other stuff you want to mention about where people can find the book or when it might be coming out or where else to find your work, where can people find that?
Well, I have, they can find the Strange Maine True Tales from the Pine Tree State page on Facebook. I'm also at strangemaine.blogspot.com. That's where I run the blog. It's a little dormant right now because I'm mostly working on the book, trying to finish it up. But you can find me there. And there's also an email link for me on that page on the strangemaine.blogspot.com.
I think I linked that in the description below so people can go right there if they'd like.
Yeah. So that's the best way to get a hold of me, and to find out what's going on, because out of anything that I'm posting about these days, it's usually updates about what I'm working on with the book. And let's see, I'm trying to think. The book itself, I'm just doing the very final, like chopping a bunch of stuff out edit. So the book is written, and now I'm finishing up the illustrations for it. So, and of course, all the scheduling is kind of off right now.
Of course, yeah.
but I would say that hopefully early next year, it should be in paper and ink form and ready to go, at which point I will be talking a lot about it because I'll be super excited because it's like, 10 plus years of work that I'm finally have been able to hand to people and say, here are these stories that I was trying to put on record for you to read. Now you can have them. So I know and that won't mark the end of my interest in Bigfoot in Maine, because clearly it's a continuing thing that's going on, and I'm still actively involved with a lot of people that I've talked to about their encounters. So
amazing. And I can't wait to see that. I mean, obviously you've put a lot of work in it, and I'm sure it's going to be detailed and really going to put Maine sort of in a good place for just telling those stories. I'm really excited.
I am too.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Michelle. It's been awesome talking with you. Hopefully we can do this again at some point. And for folks that are listening for the first time, feel free to subscribe. This is a weekly show every Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern. We have all sorts of guests, like we've had with Michelle talking about Bigfoot in Maine. Last week we talked about West Virginia cryptids. Next week we're going to be talking with Karac of Crash Course Cryptozoology and a lot of other upcoming shows. So stay tuned, guys, and thank you again, Michelle, and hope you have a good night.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Alex. We'll see you
all
soon.
Right. Bye-bye, everyone.